Welcome to the Gospel Activist Podcast, ministry of Stepping Out Ministries, where we explore how we proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ in our modern context. Here is your host, pastor and evangelist, Kevin Henry.
Well, thank you once again for joining us on the Gospel Activist Podcast. Today on the program, we're going to be looking at government regulations on evangelism. So when you're out there in public, sharing the gospel to people, strangers, maybe even people you know, what is it we're allowed to do and what are we not allowed to do? And what are our rights as Christians as we proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ? Before I get to that, I want to encourage you to join us by going to iTunes and subscribing to our podcast by looking under the podcast section for Gospel Activists. All one word, and we really appreciate if you would rate our program, as that will help our ratings in iTunes and get the word out even further as to who we are and why we are trying to equip the church in how to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. As I mentioned, we're going to be looking today at what are the government regulations, and this is specifically in regards to Canada. Some of the rules that are in other countries like the U.S. or around the world may be a little bit different. And so there are some tips I'll share today that are important that you can use to check out your own context, but some things that are a little bit more specific to Canada. First, we're going to look at the Canadian Charter of Rights, specifically Section 1 and 2. And in Section 1, it gives a list of fundamental freedoms that all Canadian citizens have. And a part of that list is some of the freedoms we have regarding our religion and what we're able to do and not do within Canada. Section 1 is what permits the Parliament and legislatures to enact laws that can place certain kinds of limitations and restrictions on the freedoms listed in Section 2 of the Charter of Rights. And those are really more just restrictions that are placed based on things like safety and care for everyone. So, for example, if you're downtown Edmonton, you can't be in the middle of the street proclaiming the gospel. You would have to be on the sidewalk and off to the side so you're not distracting flow of traffic and not being a safety issue to yourself or to others, which basically is common sense, isn't it? Here are some of the following fundamental freedoms we have as Canadians. First of all, we have freedom of conscience and religion. So that means if it's against our conscience, we can refuse to do something or to do something. Same thing in regards to religion. That means we can believe who we want to and be a part of which religion we want to be part of. We also have freedom of thought, which makes sense because everyone can think whatever they want to. Now, expressing that might be another matter at times, but we really can't think whatever we want to. After all, that is a God-given freedom that all of us have. We also have the freedom of belief, so we can choose to believe what we want to believe. We have the freedom of opinion. That means we can think what we want to and express what we want to, which relates to the next one, freedom of expression. So we can express what we believe and what we think, and our opinion. We also have the freedom of peaceful assembly, which allows us as Christians to meet together freely in churches or in other buildings where we can meet together as Christians to practice our faith. We also have the freedom of association, so we can associate with which organization that best fits what we believe as Christians. These are all the freedoms that we have under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as Canadians. Now, other countries like the U.S. has something similar to that. I encourage you, if you're an American, listen to this program, to check out what your Charter of Rights and Freedoms allow you to do and not to do. Let's look a moment at the freedom of religion. This means we have the freedom to practice religion or to refrain from practicing religion, and are free to establish media organizations with or without religious content. This is what protects the church from the state, so the state cannot interfere with what we believe, how we believe, and what we say and how we say it. However, there is a limitation to that. That it's called the limitation of undue hardship, which means that we cannot inflict hardship on others based on health, safety, and cost. And as we well know, our faith and religion of Christianity does not interfere with any of those three things. In fact, healthcare started because of the church. Also, there's a lot of safety laws that Christians have spoken about how are important to have. And we're also about caring for people's needs, and so it isn't a cost to others. Now, alongside that is our freedom to speech. And the freedom of speech for Canadian law means to entertain beliefs as a person chooses, the right to declare beliefs openly and without fear or hindrance or reprisal, and the right to manifest religious belief by worship and practice or by teaching and dissemination. Again, this is where the separation of church and state comes into play. The state cannot tell the church or Christians what to believe and to how to practice our faith. I remember not too long ago that there was a school in a town in Alberta called Busby. And at that school, an atheist got upset because they're doing the Lord's Prayer. Now the school is primarily Christians. And so it was part of their school routine still to have the Lord's Prayer. And so this atheist woman felt like her child was being segregated, which she wasn't. It was her choice to be part of the prayer or not. She didn't have to be part of the prayer. And so she brought it up to the school board, and it has become a legal issue now. But because we have the freedom for religious speech, those who want to do the Lord's Prayer in school can, because they have that right to do so. We must remember that if someone is offended, it is their fault based on their own beliefs or feelings. It is subjective and not objective. So even when it comes to practicing our faith or sharing the gospel with people, if they're offended by it, that's their choice to be offended by it. We have the right to share the gospel message, not just because the government says we do, but because God tells us to do it. Now, when we talk about free speech, here's where some of the Canadian law prohibits. The Canadian law prohibits promotion of hatred, which makes sense, because we as Christians don't hate anyone either, so we don't spread hate. The government laws says that we cannot discriminate against people of color, race, religion, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, or gender. Of which, when we preach the gospel, it doesn't promote hatred towards any of those groups. Now, there's exemptions in the bill regarding the promotion of hate, which permits the expression of opinions on religious subjects and opinions based on religious texts, which would otherwise be prohibited. That's why the Bible is not illegal. Because some of our laws saying that you can't speak against homosexuality, the Bible says that it is wrong and sinful. And so we have that right to teach that and to believe that. Again, though, even with that issue, we don't promote hate about it either. We still love the homosexual. They still need the gospel, just like everyone else needs the gospel. So we have that right to practice and to teach what God's word says, and to proclaim it, not just in the walls of a church building, but throughout the public arena. Now, here's some ways for us to be prepared for when we go to share the gospel, so we know what our rights are and how we should handle things when we're challenged as we share the gospel in the public arena. I want to remind us, first of all, to focus on the gospel and not on controversial issues. Now, sometimes those controversial issues may come up as we're sharing the gospel. Someone might point out this issue or that issue as we're talking with them. But I encourage us not to start and bring those controversial subjects up. Let others bring it up. That way you can focus just on the gospel message. And then when they have questions about controversial issues, you can then address them in a biblical way. So here's how we can be prepared. First, work in teams as much as possible to ensure safely and to vouch for each other if confronted by police. Number 2, you could carry a letter from a pastor or evangelist vouching for your legitimate activities. Such letter would say something to the effect that we are going on behalf of this church or this organization, and they know that we're doing this, and so we have their approval to do this. They have a backing of a Christian organization. Number 3, know the city ordinances. It's important to know what the rules are in a particular city before you go out to share the gospel. So that way you know what rules you're not breaking, and then you know also your rights as to what you can say, that if an officer were to come, you can say, hey, this is the city ordinance. We're not breaking this. Number 4, stay away from private property and know the difference between public and private properties. You can't assume that just walking on a sidewalk is public property. In most cases, like I know in the city of Edmonton, the sidewalk is public property. And even into most properties, within a couple feet of the property is still city property. So it's important to know those ordinances so you know your rights as to where you can set up if you're open to preaching, or where you can go and freely proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. Number 5, do not disturb the pedestrian traffic flow. I have a story a friend of mine, Scott Buck, had shared with me when he was going out and learning how to do open air preaching. And one of the people being trained was doing open air preaching in the city. And the crowd had become so large that it was flowing out into the streets. And an officer came by and said, hey, you got to shut it down because you can't have all these people spilling onto the streets and blocking traffic and the sidewalks. The preacher called out to everyone take a few steps in, and got everyone back into the sidewalk and not blocking the flow of traffic or the sidewalk traffic either. We got to be conscious of that too, because it is a matter of safety for people. We don't want to have problems or someone's lives in danger. Number 6, maintain a reasonable noise level for the situation. If you go on YouTube, you can see a lot of open-air preachers, and a lot of them are using amplification. I like to refrain from that, because it does often cause problems. Even if you fit within the city ordinances for how loud amplification can be, it often becomes a problem. So I also like to encourage, always just use your own voice for projection. On the same note, do not speak within earshot of store entrances. That doesn't mean you can't stand near an entrance to a mall if it's public property. For instance, being downtown. If you may be in front of a mall on the sidewalk, you can do that. But if there are street stores, you tend to be in the way of those places. And so I encourage people to sit up somewhere else in a place that's more conducive and not in the earshot of store entrances. Number 8, don't force people to take literature they obviously do not want to take. That's an important one. If they don't want that gospel tract as you're handing out tracts, you want to make sure you only hand it out to people who actually want it. On that same note, number 9, consider picking up any tracts passers-by may drop near you in the street. If you see a tract on the ground, pick it up. You might even be able to use it for someone else who wants to read it and hear the gospel that way. Number 10, if you are preaching in another country you are not a citizen of, remember you have no rights. Remember hearing not long ago of Tony Miano, who is an evangelist, and he had gone to England to preach the gospel, and he was arrested there. It's a thing for us not to forget that if we're in another country, we don't have any rights. I'm a Canadian citizen. If I go to the States and I break their rules, I don't get the same rights that their citizens get. They may treat me that way, but I don't get those rights still because I'm not an American citizen. Likewise, in any country you go to, it's the same thing. So before you go to another country, know the rules of that country so you don't break the rules in their country. Yes, proclaim the gospel, even if that part breaks the law, but know what the other laws are so you don't break the laws you don't need to break. Number 11, if hassled by police or other citizens, be polite and explain your rights calmly. We'll get into this further in a few moments ahead. Number 12, if you see a companion being arrested, do not interfere with the arrest. Observe from the sidelines and then call a local attorney or a pastor for help. These are some things that we can do knowing ahead of time and planning before we go out to share the gospel in whatever context it is, so that we are prepared. This list actually comes to us from biblicalevangelism.com, and I'll have a link for that in the description. We have now looked at the government regulations for evangelism, particularly in Canada. And we also looked at a list here of how we can be prepared ahead of time before we go out to share the gospel, so we know what we're doing and so we're not breaking the laws. But there's another important part for us to look at: how to handle a confrontation with the police. The information I'm about to present to you comes from soulwinning.info, and I'll post a link to this in the description. They list 13 things in how to deal with a situation with the police, and I think these are really good points for us to consider. Number one, always speak in a professional manner. It speaks back to what we know of from 1 Peter 3:15, that we're to do it with gentleness and respect. So when a police officer comes to confront us, no matter, again, the context we are in sharing the gospel, we need to be respectful and calm towards them. Number two, always designate one person in charge to talk with the police. This would be in the case of when you're with a group. You need to designate someone who can say, hey, you're going to represent us as a group, and so if there's police officers who get involved, or a heckler or some kind of problem, they're the one to deal with it. I would also recommend having some kind of recording device, whether it be audio or visual, especially visual, because there's often times that people's rights are violated when it comes to sharing the gospel. So it's good to have recording of some kind, especially visual, so you can show that this is exactly what happened. And remember, you do have the right to record the conversation with a police officer. They cannot make you turn off your audio or visual device. I would also recommend, too, that once the police have mentioned what law you're breaking, if you're not breaking a law, state the law and the freedoms that you have. Don't make it a big issue, but it's good to remind the officer of the rights that you have to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. As a part of that, ask if you're being charged with anything. And if you're not, asking if you're free to go. And then do so. Again, be respectful of the police officer, but if you're not being charged, you have the rights to continue on doing what you're doing. Number three, always make a point of asking for the officer's business card, and especially asking for their badge number. So if they don't have a business card, always ask their name and their badge number. And again, that's where having an audio or visual device to record that is helpful. When you're standing before an officer, always stand facing the officer and slightly away from their gun side. I think this keeps things a little bit calmer, because then they realize you're not going to be aggressive to them. You're just there simply sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. You're not there to cause problems. You're just there to save people with the gospel message. Number five, never stand with a sign in your hand while talking to the officer. Through soulwinning.info, on their article about this, they even say that police officers will actually ask you to move the sign or put it down or hand it off to someone else. So before they even ask you, hand it off to someone else and move away. I'm actually not an advocate of using signs when you go out open air preaching, because sometimes a lot of signs that are used are unnecessary attention seeking. Often they're offensive, and so sure, if you want to use a sign, but be careful how you're using that sign. So it's declaring the gospel and not trying to cause confrontation. Like I said, I prefer not to use a sign. You can verbally share the gospel or hand out tracts. We don't really need a sign to declare that. Number six, determine the temperament of the call officer before you commit yourself to making decisions that will be irreversible. They go further to say this about this point. The officer is doing the same to you. Confrontations with police are often caused by failure to do this, and will ultimately drag you into an argument that has no solution beyond a physical standoff. Definitely don't want to get into that. There are a number of things to do immediately to help you determine the temperament of a call officer. A, upon his approach, smile and attempt to shake his hand while introducing yourself and any other preacher close by that is not preaching. B, attempt to maintain the lead in the conversation and inquire as to how the officer is doing today or how's the weather today. C, behave naturally as if nothing is wrong. Because really, nothing is wrong, right? You're just practicing your right to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. If the officer is arrogant and proud, he will immediately cut you off, and you will know that he has already predetermined you are doing something wrong. If the officer resents allowing you to take the lead and talks down to you, immediately stop talking. And listen quietly and politely. And when he is finished, ask him to call a supervisor. You cannot deal rationally with this type of officer when he has already made up in his mind you are breaking the law. He will not be taught constitutional law from you. If the officer is calm and does not mind allowing you to lead the conversation and is polite answering your inquiries, keep him in this mood while politely explaining the situation and your knowledge of your constitutional rights to preach in the open air, or again, whatever context you are sharing the gospel. Refrain from attempting to teach the officer what the law says. Confine your remarks to explain your knowledge of the law. You will get further framing your conversation as to what you know about the law than about what he doesn't know. Number 7, never go out on the street without first determining before God what your set options are and what you are going to do with his help. They say here, you will never demonstrate confidence in your position to the officer if you have not ahead of time made up your mind to go to jail, if need be. Indecision on your part strengthens an officer's confidence in attempting to bully you into submission. Decisions made under stress are many times the wrong decision unless you are trained by experience to work that way. Be very, very careful in allowing pressure, fear, and stress to change your mind on the street about a plan you are prayerfully constructed when not under the stress of this moment. You know, as we go to share the gospel, the world doesn't like the gospel message we have. People don't like to hear that they're sinners. But yeah, we're called to go out. That's part of making disciples, sharing the gospel, so they come to faith, so they become a disciple of Jesus Christ. So it is, even more so today, more of a chance in North America to be arrested for sharing our faith. So be prepared. Be ready to possibly go to jail. You may or may not be charged, but be prepared to be put into jail for sharing the gospel. After all, that's what happened to the apostles. They didn't break any laws, and they shared the gospel, but they were sometimes arrested and thrown into jail for it. Number 8, define a police order to cease. This is one that we need to be careful with. Because we really don't want to defy the police officer, because we're told in Scripture to obey the authorities that God has placed over us. But we still do have the right to preach the gospel. And so here's how we handle this situation. The authors of this website say this: this is a difficult time in any preacher's ministry and in any officer's day. Never do this disrespectfully. Never do this except in matters pertaining to free speech and right to assembly. Never do this unless you have conducted yourself lawfully in everything you have done that day. Again, that's why it's important to know the law. There is a difference between legal conduct and lawful conduct. The right to preach, distribute gospel tracts, and display signs are lawfully protected constitutional activity. However, there are times and places that those lawful activities can be restricted in the manner by which you exercise such lawful conduct. When those restrictions narrowly drawn by the authorities so they do not unreasonably interfere with the law exercise of your constitutional rights, the police are within the law in enforcing those restrictions. Again, that's why it's important to know the law and to know what is public and private property. To defy those restrictions makes your lawful conduct illegal. Again, let me say that. To defy those restrictions makes your lawful conduct illegal. However, the personal opinion of the police officer is not considered by the Supreme Court as meeting time, place, and manner restrictions, but is itself unlawful. Examples of conduct police can restrict: passing out tracts to people in automobiles driving or stopping in the street, blocking entrances to stores, blocking pedestrian traffic, attempting to force people to take literature after they have refused it, preaching in a residential or hospital district, or an area restricted for the protection of government officials, etc. Number 9, how to refuse an officer's order. Again, they write here, always be polite but firm. If you need a moment to advise the people preaching with you about what you're about to do, most officers will allow you time to consult with folks. It is wise to excuse the women and minor children to move away from the vicinity, like across the street. Always allow one person to remain at a safe distance to film any arrests and verbal exchanges. Without delay, offer a prayer and advise the officer in charge that you respect his authority and understand he has an unpleasant job to do, but that you cannot consciously adhere to his unconstitutional and unlawful demand, and that you will have to continue preaching even at the cost of imprisonment. If at all possible, avoid having to defy an officer's command when the police are overbearing and overreacting. It will not always be avoidable, but try your best. Once you have advised the officer in charge of your intentions to continue preaching, then without further conversation, step away from the officer and continue preaching. Number 10, submit to the arrest. I think this is an important thing because, again, God's Word tells us to respect those God has placed in authority over us. So when an officer is attempting to arrest you, simply follow through with their directions. Don't be like some people at protests where they lay down on the ground and make it a lot harder for the officer. Make it easier for the officer and submit to their arrest. Number 11, here's some things that they give to watch for and avoid while being arrested. You are a preacher, not an activist or a protester. It's important to remember. You're not there to cause problems. You're only there to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. Behave like a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. You came there to stand and preach. Do not sit down and protest because of the cost of standing to preach is going to jail. Be subject to the arrest according to the scriptures. When arrested by an overreacting officer, be very careful and constantly alert. There are officers who will physically rough you up to provoke even a smallest reaction from you, so they can escalate it into resistance and either harm you physically or charge you with resisting arrest. From this point on, you are required by law to give your name, address, and birth date, but nothing more. Keep your mouth shut and resist the temptation to speak further. Again, this is making it easier for the officer in arresting. And it also shows that you're there for the right reasons. Again, not there to cause problems, just to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. Number 12, the advice to not sign any statement or promise to do anything other than to show up for trial. Number 13, don't threaten legal action, nor pursue legal action. Now, as I say that, I realize you may need a lawyer involved if it goes to trial. But don't make threats like that. Don't threaten that you're going to cause problems for them. Again, respect the authority God has placed in those police officers. I've seen times on YouTube where there's been an open-air preacher out, and some of them do threaten legal action. They'll mention, I've been a part of this case and I've won, so you'll have a legal issue coming to you if you don't let me do what I want to do here. That's not good either. It's not respectful. Don't make threats. It makes it look like you're there for any other reason other than sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. Again, remember the words of 1 Peter 3:15. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. No matter the context of how you share the gospel, whether it be cold contact or open air preaching or door to door or any other style of evangelism, make sure you're doing it to honor Christ. And as you do it, to do it, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, with gentleness and respect. Again, we're in a world that doesn't want to hear the gospel message. Sometimes they become offended by it. But that's why we need to show gentleness and respect, because it shows love to these people. These are some of the ways for us to how to handle a confrontation with a police officer. It's important for us as Christians to be prepared to know our legal rights when we share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we also need to realize, though, that there is a danger, that we could go to jail for sharing our faith. Go out there and share the gospel. Be prepared and know how to handle any situation that comes up as you share the gospel. And know your rights. Again, it's not a matter of throwing our rights in people's faces, especially the officer's face. But know it so you know how to protect yourself when you're out there sharing the gospel. Well, thank you again for joining us on the podcast. I really hope this episode is helpful to you as you go out to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. Being prepared and ready for sharing the gospel and talking to people. In our next episode, I'll be interviewing Pastor Chad Graham about evangelism and church planting. Until then, remember to preach the gospel to any person, anytime, anywhere, and no matter the cost.
You have been listening to the Gospel Activist Podcast, a ministry of Stepping Out Ministries. To submit a question for Pastor Kevin to answer on the podcast, visit us at www.steppingoutministries.com/podcast.html. Thank you for listening, and we invite you to join us for our next podcast.